What's going on, folks? Ted from Immersion here, and my patrons voted, and while I was hoping to get this out on Tuesday, I thought better late than never. They wanted me to talk about my top 10 things that I want to see in whatever we're going to get in 2024, D&D 5.5e versus 6e and things like that. Now, I do want to qualify that it is whatever I want to see, not necessarily what I think is most likely that we will, in fact, get. There's a little bit of crossover on that list, right? There are some things that I want to see that I also think we will be getting, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. So that's pretty much it. Just take this time to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, as that number continues to go up, which is awesome. And yeah, let's dive right in. Number 10. Artificer from the start. Rather than having it be locked behind Eberron or eventually Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, if you are going to embrace the Artificer as the true 13th class for Dungeons & Dragons, have it in the player's handbook from the get-go and whatever your revised version of Dungeons & Dragons is coming in 2024. I also imagine that this revised version will in fact just be the core rule books, right? So Player's Handbook, Monster Manual, Dungeon Master's Guide. So that's kind of what I'm basing a lot of the decisions for stuff I want to see in, is based off of those three books being the ones they're going to put out. Number 9. Also pretty likely, I imagine, class and subclass fixes to be in line with the current meta. And by that, I mean anything that we've seen that's a marked improvement over subclasses or classes that, the newer ones are just drastically better than the original. And I think you can easily see that. Probably one of the best examples would be the sorcerers that were released in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Each one of those comes with an extra 2 spells for the first 5 levels. Again, sorcerers suffering from the smallest spell list in general. But that would be updated so that all existing sorcerers that we have will have that update. Things like that. The fact that all the newer rangers get 1 extra spell per level as they, for levels 1 through 5. The original rangers don't get that. That would be updated. If we have changes to the way mechanics work in general, kind of like how pet mechanics have changed, pet mechanics in any class that has a pet mechanic would have that applied across the board. Any nuancy word changes that alter the way abilities work would be applied across the board. And just general overall, like I said, meta fixes. So whatever the case may be for that, whether that's that the sorcerer gets more spells to make it more in line with something else, the way certain abilities work that might have been like, oh, you get an extra attack, maybe now it's as part of this action, you can make an additional attack. Just the general wording and fixes to make all existing subclasses that we already had in line with everything that's been newly printed. Now, that's the other question that we'll have to see, is as we know they're calling like Tasha's Cauldron and Xanathar's Guide to be separate, and they're going to be reprinted in this expanded rules book box set that comes out in January. Is this Player's Handbook updated stuff we're getting in 2024 just the revised version of what's in the Player's Handbook, and you're supposed to reference Xanathar's Guide and Tasha's Cauldron for the other ones? Or will all of those be reprinted? I doubt it, because that would make the book pretty massive. Number 8. Last, for what I consider to be the more than likely going to be in there, is what I would call racial and feat-based spellcasting fixes. If you've been following along with the channel, I've talked about this recently, but any new race that gets spellcasting, or any new feat style, anything that grants you spellcasting, has a certain wording in there that says, if you also have spell slots, you can cast it using those spell slots. For example, the Fairy, which just released in Wild Beyond the Witchlight, has access to a couple of spells, and it says you can cast those once per long rest, or if you have spellcasting spell slots of the appropriate level, you can cast it using those spell slots. I think that this needs to be ported backwards to things like the Tiefling and other races that have magic, as well as things like Magic Initiate. For example, new things like the Fey-touched and Shadow-touched spells give you 1 spell and then another spell of your choice that you can cast each once per long rest, but if you happen to have spell slots, those are now basically, for all intents and purposes, on your spell list. Well, they're not technically considered a spell on your spell list, but you can use your spell slots to cast those spells. Bring that backwards, even it out so that even if you chose some feat from the Player's Handbook, it's not outclassed by a newer version. Same thing by choosing a newer race that lets you now have extra access to spell slots. Fix it for things like the Tiefling and other races from earlier on that also had that. Again, I think that's pretty likely to be a change we're going to see, but they're waiting for it to, excuse me, until 2024 to release that. Number 7. Now, while I don't want to demean any third-party creators out there, because there's a ton of great options that exist, I still would like to have this initially from the primary source, but rules for harvesting and salvaging monster bits. We've talked about it countless times, and I did feel like Fizban's Treasury of Dragons was the opportune time to put it out there, and while it didn't seem like that in the pre-release material we've heard about, we'll see when the book eventually drops. My review copy should be coming either today or tomorrow, and we'll take a look and see, but everybody always wants to salvage and cut up and harvest bits from monsters, specifically dragons, and rules to allow us to figure out what that looks like would be greatly appreciated, especially from what Wizards of the Coast would consider to be a balanced, way to do it, coming from the source who created the game. So again, like I said, there's tons of third-party options out there, and even if they do make a first-party one, you might end up using the third-party ones anyway, but I'd like to have that option. Number 6. Along those same lines, rules for buying and selling of magic items. We have really loosey-goosey rules between Xanathar's Guide and the Dungeon Master's Guide. And then we start to see slight changes. For example, in, I want to say it was in either the Domains of Delight or perhaps in the, I think it was in Domains of Delight. Or it might have been recently in the Minkskin Boo thing. They had actual magic items listed out with purchase prices for various towns. And that's wild to me because they were hard against that. And like you had to go through a fence and find someone to buy and sell stuff for you. It was a whole big process. If you could just give us pricing amounts at the end of every magic item description, buying and selling prices, that would be huge. Or just a general, because I don't think you can generalize it. That's my other thing. You can't just say common magic items because not all common magic items are created equally. Same thing with like rare, right? So for example, a +2 sword is great. But a Cloak of Displacement, in some instances, could be argued is better, right? There are definitely, similar to how challenge rating is, it actually didn't make it on this list, challenge rating, but that should be one as well. Similar how challenge rating, all CR1s and CR4s are not created equal. Same thing with all challenge rating, or all uncommon and common magic items or whatever. Some are created better than others. They still fall within the same rarity, but they're more useful or have more benefits. So rules for buying and selling of magic items, which would be concrete and tied to the specific item, would be appreciated, right? Because maybe a bag of holding is only 500 gold, but a +1 sword is 150. I don't know. Same rarity, different pricing. So some sort of way to scale up and down, or like, even like I said, just give me, I would be fine with each item having its own printed buying and selling price. Number 5. And once again, following up on that, an actual crafting system of some kind. Now, I'm including crafting of common items and mundane items, but I'm also including magic items in this as well. Again, I don't want to go back and continue to say, oh, I like how they did it in 3.5, but I did. At the end of every magic item, it gave it a price, and it also gave you what you needed to craft said magic item. It would tell you need this kind of magic, and this kind of feat, and this kind of whatever, and then this much gold, or however you want to do it, to craft a magic item. So that would be really cool. I think that would be something we could have. Also, like, decent rules for actually crafting mundane items. But like I said, I think magic items would be the bigger one, because they talk about it a lot. Like, oh, you have to find the blueprint, and then you have to find the materials, and all this stuff, and if you find it, then you can craft it. And, like, that seems like a very half-assed answer. Like, I like where you're going with this concept of not all items is easy to make, and to craft a truly unique magic item, you need to find a blueprint or a recipe. And then you need to find the stuff that goes in that recipe. You know what would have been great? An example. Just one, even, of one of those things. To craft a circlet of blasting, you need to find the Heartstone of a fire elemental and a circlet made out of platinum. I don't know. Something like that. Tell me what I need to do, or give me some examples of how to craft them. Or better yet, in the ultimate TED world, you not only give us the pricing for buying and selling, but you also give us the blueprints for everything. So when we go, and this is why I think we just need a magic item book, period, not necessarily a revised version of the Dungeon Master's Guide. You could give me both, though, and I'd be fine with that. But, you know, here's how you make a Storm Giant's belt. Here's how you make a Cloak of Displacement, Necklace of Prayer Beads, whatever. Here's what you need. And then that gives the player something to quest towards. Hey, we found a recipe, or we learned the recipe for a Amulet of Health, or, you know, a Headband of Intellect, or something like that. How do we go and do that? Okay, well, we know we need these 5 things. Now we have a quest that even if we want to take a little break from the main story, we know what we're looking for. We want to find these 5 things. You can go off on your side quest to find them. The DM can have fun making up how that's going to work. And then they come back and they craft the thing, but they also feel like they earned it because they did things to get it. They didn't have to just rely on random loot drops from rolls on a table or just the GM's benevolence. They can actually manifest this item for themselves by playing the game. Number 4. Diversification of casting stats. And by that, I mean the fact that we have 4 classes out of the 13 that use charisma. We have the wizard, which was for the longest time the only class using intelligence. Now you could say subclasses like Eldritch Knight and Arcane Trickster Rogue do in fact use intelligence, and you'd be correct, but I don't really consider that because you have to choose the subclass to get access to that. But if you're a wizard, you're one of the only classes that has use for intelligence. Intelligence often becomes a dump stat for just about everybody else. We also have the cleric and druid use wisdom, as does the ranger. And then we have the bard, sorcerer, warlock, and paladin all use charisma. We have now added in the artificer taking care of intelligence, but I think the fact that we have 4 using charisma seems like we could maybe split something up. I'm okay with keeping the bard charisma. I think we all agree that just clicks and it makes sense. I'm also okay keeping the paladin as charisma. I think that also makes sense. But I think we should probably change either the sorcerer or the warlock away from charisma. You could keep one. You could make maybe one of them intelligence. I've heard a lot of people push to have a warlock maybe be an intelligence-based caster. I still stick by a constitution caster for the sorcerer, right? It's literally your bloodline and your inherent powers from your blood that give you this origin of sorceress magic. Make it constitution. Yeah, it might be a little one-sided where, constitution's your casting stat and your health, but your health is still a d6, I assume. I don't know if they're going to change that. I'm also realizing as I make this list, there's going to be some bonus items, so you might want to stick around to the end because I do have several bonuses that I just thought of. Anyway, diversification of casting stat. Number 3. More weapons/weapon types. I think a lot of people feel like this too. There's only so many options you have, and with the limited options, it's also unfortunate because they gave us almost all of our cool magic items are swords. There's very few that are unique items, and I would like, and the problem is they made it in such a way, and it's not really a problem, it's actually decent game design, that it's easy to just homebrew something, right? So I could be wielding a great sword, right? That's 2d6, but I could easily, with really no effort on my part, and if the DM's more than willing to have just a little bit of imagination, I could have it be a scythe. Like, it looks like a scythe, but that's purely just cosmetic. It still does the same damage as a greatsword. But a lot of people would rather have a scythe be its own weapon with its own damage stats and things like that. But realistically, there's no way. That's like the people who always want to have a katana, and it's really, a katana is essentially just a longsword. So that's what even the Dungeon Master's Guide states that a katana is a longsword. It's just reskinned to fit whatever kind of setup you want, as opposed to just being it's a D8 and a D10 versatility. It's just you call it a katana as opposed to calling it a longsword. But again, people would like to have katana have its own stats. So I think more unique, interesting weapon types, right? Like, I'm playing a monk right now. I was using nunchucks, and I basically just considered those to be clubs, which is a monk weapon. So I used my monk martial arts dice to change as we level up. But, perhaps set alone stats for nunchucks or rope darts or, whatever you want to do. Just something unique, some more options. Maybe if it's not even unique items just in the flair and the aesthetic of it, think about the mechanical holes, right? We have a 2d6 slashing weapon in the greatsword. We have a 2d6 bludgeoning weapon in the maul, but we don't have a 2d6 piercing weapon, right? Maybe you may make something like that. We have a D12 piercing weapon in the lance. We have a D12 slashing weapon in the great axe. We don't have a D12 bludgeoning damage weapon. Just to fill the holes that, you see what I'm saying? Like there's certain items that fit where we have an item that does a certain die type. Sometimes it's versatile, D8, D10, and we don't have another version of that. You know, we have one, you know, there's definitely holes in what's finesse and what's thrown. So just fill it out, give us the gamut of all the different kinds of items, so that way we have a little bit more versatility. I guess also to my original standpoint, though, you could just homebrew them to fit. You know, this is my, you know, super spear or whatever, and it basically, for all intents and purposes, is a great sword, but I just have it do piercing damage instead of doing, you know, instead of, you know, just changing it aesthetically. I don't know. I do think there's definitely an option there. I think people would love to have more options to play around with, but you let me know what you think in the comments down below. Number 2. Cool and unique mundane items. Right, we saw this in older editions as well. We had things like Thunderstones and Sun Rods and Tanglefoot bags and all sorts of things like this, that they were cool, or not even magic items. They were just mundane things that they like, I guess, minorly magical, or like a Sun Rod, for example, is basically like a glow stick. It's a rod that you can crack that basically gives you the light of a torch, but it doesn't provide any heat. It's essentially like a big glow stick. Tanglefoot bags were bags basically made of some sort of gooey substance that you could throw at folks, and like if you hit them with it, it would slow them down or root them in place for a little while. We had Thunderstones, which was basically like a flashbang grenade. Things like this, but they weren't considered really magical items, but they were mundane things that you'd find in like the adventuring gear section of the player's handbook that you could buy to just continue to build your, you know, build out your character, give you a couple other options, maybe not stuff that you'd want to take a ton of, but you know, you might find a use for that Thunderstone in that one, you know, oh, we need to make a distraction, you know, we have something to do. Things like that. So I would love to see some form of that return, and just general interesting mundane equipment, which is why I do still continue to think we need some sort of equipment guide. Whether it be all magic items or magic and mundane mixed together, I think we need some sort of, that would be a great resource that I think a lot of people are asking for, or even if they weren't asking for it, they'd be very happy that they have it. Number 1. Before we dive into my last one here, I did want to go over, I had a couple of runner-ups. So one, I think we should update the monk to a D10 hit die. I think it's about time. I think the monk has clearly, however you feel about the monk, and if people do want me to make a video as someone who has played several monks at this point, currently playing one as we speak, I think the monk has kind of transitioned into a D10 spot, right? We have our paladin, our sort of holy martial character. We have holy with an H. We have our fighter, which is our holy WH kind of martial character. And we have our ranger, our sort of nature martial character. And the monk kind of falls into that unarmed martial artist style character. They don't have to necessarily be a martial artist, but I think they were given a D8 hit die, and if you look at what else has a D8 hit die, that's most of the more the mixed casters, I'd call them, right? Your clerics, your druids, your warlock, as opposed to like the true casters, the only a caster, or the bards also D8s. Like your sorcerers and your wizards are the more quintessential spell mage type, you know, squishy types. But you've got bard, cleric, druid, and warlock. And then you also have the rogue, which is supposed to be kind of a squishy glass cannon-y type. And it feels like they want to really have the monk solidify this, I am a bruiser, maybe I can be a little kitey and move around, and like I can hit guys and I can run away. But I feel like for the most part, when you look at a lot of the subclasses, it feels like most of them want to be up front and fighty, and like the brawler style class. So I feel like if you're going to do that, give them the D10 hit die to reflect the fact that they're supposed to be in melee. And I think that might fix not all of the issues that people have with a monk, but that would be a big one. By giving them that little bit of extra health, it'll help put them more, define their role as more of a melee fighter. It would be updates to other classes. I'll use the warlock as an example. which is my personal kind of rule when it comes to like game design, is if it's not an option, don't make it one. And by that I mean if there's an ability or something that a character or player basically has to choose because it's too good not to choose it, because whether it be how something functions or what have you, that basically like I would be really dumb to not choose this, and the game's kind of pushing me in this direction, then it shouldn't be an option for me. It should be just something that I'm given. So my example for this would be Warlocks with Eldritch Blast, right? Yes, I know you don't need to take Eldritch Blast, and most people will be like, oh, I don't take it on my Warlock, and for the most part, when you do that, you're just doing it to be difficult and trying to break out of that mold and be unique. But if you look at the amount of invocations that are existing in the current Warlock that are tied specifically to altering Eldritch Blast and how it functions, it's clear that Eldritch Blast is something you should be taking. So how do you fix that? You don't make it a choice. You make it a feature, right? Eldritch Blast is no longer a cantrip. It's now a class feature that you get at level 1. Still gives you the freedom to choose invocations associated with Eldritch Blast if you want, or you do something like changing the invocations to make them not just apply to Eldritch Blast, but to apply to cantrips. So, right, Agonizing Blast, which gives a plus charisma modifier in damage to Eldritch Blast attacks, becomes Agonizing Cantrips, and all cantrips get charisma modifier to their damage roll. So that way, if you do want to choose something else, you can choose something else, right? And some of those different, like the Eldritch Blast, the one that pushes, doubles the range of Eldritch Blast, or whatever the case may be. It doesn't double it, it just sets it at a certain range, but like maybe that doubles the range of all cantrips, not just Eldritch Blast, so that these things can be, it's clearly less of a choice, like I could choose Eldritch Blast, or I could be slightly suboptimal to make a point. I don't know. That's how I feel, so I think that would be a change, and that's just the best example I have. But if there are other things out there where this is clearly the best option out of everything that I could choose, and that's what most people almost always choose, maybe that should become a class feature and not a choice, or be removed from the game entirely. Challenge rating, I mentioned it earlier. Just fix it, make it real, make it useful, or come up with better encounter design tools. Speaking of design, homebrew rules, like actual good rules for homebrewing stuff with full-blown examples explaining of how you go about doing that. You want to talk about homebrewing a subclass, give us rules about homebrewing a subclass, and then show us and show your process. Build the subclass. That would be great. Similar to magic or to weapons, give us new armor types or more varied types of armor. Lastly, of my bonus ones here is magic items that are specific for all classes. We know we have certain magic items. There's a ton of magic items that are useful by only a sorcerer, warlock, or wizard. There is not, I don't think there's any one specific magic item, for example, that's usable only by barbarians or only by monks or only by rangers. There are a couple that are usable by multiple options, but like, for example, I don't think there's anything specific for a monk or a barb or a fighter for that matter. Give us items, let everybody feel unique. All right, that's it for my bonus ones. Let's move on to actually what number 1 is, which is all classes should have at least a couple attacking and saving throw spells. I have one more caveat to this in a second. But like, for example, if you look at cantrips, there are certain classes that have attacking cantrips where they can roll their own dice and make an attack against an opponent. Whereas others, for example, bards and clerics, most clerics anyway, most bards, have only saving throw based cantrips. Like I've said it before and I'll say it again. I feel like I like having attack roll spells and attack roll related things because I feel like when I fail and I miss, that's on me. That's like it's my fault. I know it's really the dice and it's random. But if I continue to have to say like, hey, make a saving throw against Sacred Flame, and you just happen to always roll higher than my saving throw and constantly they take no damage from my Sacred Flame as a cleric, I'm kind of turned off by Sacred Flame and I'm kind of bummed out about it. So I might stop using it because I don't feel like, you know, the failure is outside of my control. It's in what the DM rolls. And not to play a cynical player versus DM scenario, but you don't technically know, most of the time, what they're rolling. If they're rolling behind a screen or otherwise, you won't know. So could they be fudging it every time? It's entirely possible. Are they? Probably not, but they could be. So when I get to roll myself, I feel like I'm in control and I enjoy that, right? You know, you have dice that roll hot, or, you know, you particularly like using a set of dice, you get to do that. So at least if every class had access to a couple of spells, cantrips, and higher level spells that do attack rolls, and then obviously there's a ton obviously in the game that do saving throws, but just so everybody can have that little bit of control over their own spells if they want. And to that point as well, every class should have like a decent amount of good concentration and non-concentration spells. I feel like, for example, the poor druid has a lot of really powerful spells, but almost all of them are concentration based, which is kind of a bummer. So I would like a little split on that as well. So this was kind of a weird video of just me talking at you guys about some things. Like I said, I don't know if any of this is actually going to make it into the game. Hopefully, maybe Wizards will watch this video, and they'll take. Feel free to take all of this stuff, Wizards, and apply it to your game. And I feel like I can't be the only one who feels this way, and I'd love for you to tell me in the comments how you feel about it, what stuff you'd like to see. Am I off base completely, or do you completely agree with me? Let me know in the comments down below. A huge shout out once again to my patrons over on Patreon for voting for this topic for today's video. Again, supposed to be on Tuesday, better late than never. And again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.